I want to talk about political parties for a moment, how we talk about politics. There's a lot of anger in our political discourse these days, and it occurs to me that one of the reasons why there is this tension in the way we talk about politics is that we imagine that political policies grow out of interests. And what do I mean by that? Everyone has an interest, but I mean interest is we look at a particular policy, let's call it the immigration policy. Conservatives oftentimes want to limit immigration, and liberals oftentimes want to grow immigration. That's not always the case, but let's just take that as an example. And what we assume is that the reason those policies develop is because people have an interest in something, either an interest in themselves and their power, interest in their place in society, an interest in their economic fortune. So what do we say about someone that wants to limit immigration? That they're nervously holding on to their place in society, and they don't want to give it up, and their interest in that drives them to make certain policy decisions. So why don't Republicans want more welfare? Because they're afraid of their wealth, and they don't want to see their wealth taken away from them, so they hold to that interest, and then from that interest comes all these policy decisions. And then same for the other side, so that you look at a Democrat or a liberal and you say, well, their interest is in more power. They want to grow political influence and political power, and so they make policies like welfare so they can empower the government to control people's lives, right? So if you're listening to Rush Limbaugh on the one hand, or you're listening to, I don't know, Matt Lauer on the other, wherever you're going from for your news. But the point is, you define these political policies, right, by the interest that you think they have, and what this becomes then really is a criticism of the person, right? So Republicans are just so evil, Democrats are just so power hungry, whatever you want to say. And that's a mistake on multiple levels. Really, what's important to realize is that when people develop political policy and policy issues, that grows out not out of necessarily a self-interest, but it grows out of a worldview. Right? You have a view of the world and how it works, and you pick the policies that agree with that worldview. And so, I don't mean to be oversimplistic here, but there are at least two general worldviews, right, that people use to develop policies, specific policies, what to do on welfare, what to do on immigration, what to do on taxation. There's been recent thinking these days to say that party affiliation, political affiliation, comes from your brain wiring. I think we need to re-energize our discourse, political discourse, by imagining that our political decisions do not come from hard wiring, and they don't come from necessarily self-interest. They may, to some degree or another, but they ultimately come from a worldview. So what are the two worldviews? One, say, let's call it liberal and let's call it conservative. And these are old traditional things, right? They've not just been developed since Bush went to Iraq, or since Lyndon Johnson or Nixon decided to stay in Vietnam, right? Or FDR developed the New Deal. The idea behind liberal and conservative are worldviews that are much older than that. So let me just unwind them for you just for a second. So the liberal worldview, as we call it that, we use the word progressive, which, sidebar, I don't think is all that progressive necessarily by historic terms. If you're interested in looking at what progressivism is, look at Arthur Link, his book Progressivism, or his study of Woodrow Wilson. Fabulous. Sidebar, I'll leave that alone. Let's call it liberal. The worldview of the liberal is that the society, right, culture, and human moral values are all part of an evolutionary process. And what I mean by evolutionary is that it is the normal way of time and life developing. So, in other words, if things are left to develop on their own, they will gradually get better. Remember Barack Obama quoting Martin Luther King Jr. saying that the moral universe bends towards justice. Or you're on the right side of history. I've heard those phrases. What that means is that society will grow, become more equal and better and fair on its own. And the only thing stopping it are these calcified holdovers from traditional era, certain views of marriage, certain views of morality, certain views of culture. And as long as those remain rigid, society can't break out and grow the way it can. If that's the case, and you think that way, then in order to improve society, socially, culturally, economically, what you need to do is go around with your sledgehammer and start breaking up all of these petrified, calcified parts of our culture and society. So traditional marriage, get rid of that. Traditional views of earning and labor and jobs, get rid of that. And the more you break up, the more you free up the raw materials for development to happen. Because everything is growing on its own towards improvement. All you need to do is get out of the way. So the thing is to break these things up and out of the way. Now this is opposite, exactly opposite from a conservative view. A conservative view doesn't see the society you and I live in now, modern America, 21st century, as being an evolutionary necessity. In other words, it gradually improves to the state no matter what happens. Instead, this is a really strange, delicate arrangement, right? We've come to a free society by hard work and construction, and it's delicate. So the metaphor is not evolution, where if you break it, it just gets better. The metaphor really is a house of cards in the wind. And you've got a lot of these pieces that are barely holding on. Law and order, work ethic, families, nuclear families, and all of these things are holding. Right? They are the pinions, they are the ligaments holding this very delicate structure together. And if you knock one of these out, you jeopardize the rest of it. Now this has been since the founding of America and before, actually. I mean, all cultures talk this way at some point or another, that their traditions are what's holding society together. This made more sense, let's say, before modern industrialization, if you go back to, say, the 18th century, because medieval life and that sort of de-industrialized society, demodernized, as I pre-modern society, was right there in the background, and you were always ready to slip right back into the medieval way of poor economic output, poor food, poor health, unscientific, and all of that. So that conservatives traditionally, and if you were looking for a starting point for this maybe in modern history, you'd go to Edmund Burke's Reflections of the French Revolution. You're looking for those moments where the society was developing to the point that it had finally reached to a stopping point, a point of progress. And then that was delicate, and you need to carefully move on to the next point of progress. So the founding of America, the becoming of industrial revolution with its economic advances, the 20th century, and the information revolution, and elections and votes and constitutions. All of this is delicate. Now, in that worldview, if you plan to bring in a demographic, let's say a foreign people group, immigrants in large numbers, you bring in other cultural values, other values about family, about labor, about spending money, about all of these things, you threaten to overthrow or destroy some of those key pinions holding up a modern Western society. So that a conservative is not terrified that they will lose influence necessarily, or terrified that someone sitting next to them on the train will be brown-skinned. The fear is that those cultural values from other places will come in here and destroy some of those carefully crafted ligaments holding a modern republic together. And how do you replace it? This goes to the family too. If the family module, nuclear family, man, woman, child, has been the cornerstone of modern society since Rome, what happens when you remove that? Can Western society continue? The conservative says probably not, that the structure is too delicate. The liberal, on the other hand, says we've got here because we've got to progress like this because that's the way things are. And the only reason we've gotten here, if you look through history, is every time they find a tradition, they break it down. So you get rid of traditional, say Christian society, you break that down. You break down old ways of looking at economics, you break down old ways of looking at society, you break down race barriers. And every time you break down a barrier, or a stronghold of tradition in society, society just gets better automatically. So a liberal looks at immigration and says, more, yes, break it down, bust up the culture that we have, the white, Northern European culture that's brought us this republic. It's keeping us frozen in the 1780s. Break it up and let's move on. Same thing with gay marriage. Yeah, gay marriage is great. Diversity, break up those old conventions. The only way we're going to grow as a society to the next evolved social status is if we break up these traditions, marriage being the next one. So you can see by looking at that, then the tension on these policy issues specifically really goes back to a whole general worldview. How do you look at the world in general? And once you look at the world in a certain way, you're going to end up supporting certain policies and not other ones. And I think if we think this way, it allows us to disagree with one another a little better. If I'm a conservative, I can look at a liberal and go, I get it, I see why you're supporting these things. My argument would be, I think you're moving too fast. If I'm a liberal looking at a conservative, I go, oh, okay, I see what you really want to hold society. I think society is more resilient than you think it is. And either way, we get a way to talk about these things persuasively, right? In informed ways, rather than just blaming everyone for being either too power hungry or too selfish with their money or their resources. It's just a thought as we go into this new era of what seems to be a very polarized political discourse.